Welcome to Her Success Matters, a podcast exploring how advisors can work together to build a pathway for women to succeed in financial services. I am your host, Christine Shaw, Chief Executive Officer of Investment News. This podcast will give you rare insider access to the top financial services executives who are taking action to break down the barriers for the next generation of female advisors. You will also hear from some amazing and inspiring women who have forged their own pathway to success. Welcome to Her Success Matters. In this episode, we will center the conversation around impactful women building multicultural teams that bring financial services to underserved markets. I'm thrilled to be joined by Christine Gagnon, Chief Financial Officer of African Asset Finance Company. AAFC was launched in 2017 to provide services to Africa's underserved market. Christine is responsible for the accounting, finance, credit, and risk functions on a global level. AAFC is headquartered in New York with offices in Africa, the Middle East, and Europe. Together, we will learn more about Christine's journey and how she's working to build leadership roles for more women across the globe. Christine, I'm so thrilled to have you join us today. Welcome to Her Success Matters.
Thank you, Christine. I'm really happy to be here.
So let's start the conversation today learning about you and your background.
Sure. I started my career in accounting in the Big Four. I started at PricewaterhouseCoopers back in 2001. I spent the majority of my career in the financial services industry. I went to a financial institution and then to Ernst & Young, where I spent the majority of my time then on emerging markets. So that was my first exposure to Africa. So in 2016 and 17, I actually moved to Johannesburg and spent 2 years as the COO of Financial Services Africa. As the COO of Financial Services Africa, I really grew fond of the continent, the people, the experience. And from that point, I became set on really making sure I had an opportunity to focus on emerging markets going forward. So in 2019, I joined African Asset Finance as a CFO, and here we are 2 years later.
That's amazing. So what I would love to understand and learn a little bit more is what made you choose accounting as a young woman as your career choice? Because not a lot of women choose it. A lot of women accidentally get into it, but I love that you chose it. So let's hear about that.
Sure. I started in accounting. I took a class in high school, actually, and that is a very strange story. I took an accounting class and I failed my first exam. I think I got a 35. I understood the concepts, but if you know accounting, you sort of make one mistake and it follows you through. And the whole problem was just a disaster. So I went to drop the class and I went home that evening and my phone rang and it was my teacher. I'm, saying, hello, and she said, "Can I speak to your dad?" And I was like, oh my God, why? I could see her talking to my dad, was nodding his head, and they were talking. And he says, yep, okay, I'll talk to her. So he hung up the phone and said to me, "Your teacher doesn't think you should drop the class. You have some potential. You have high potential. She'll let you take the exam over if you just give it one more go." So I did. And I was really successful. It came naturally to me. I got an A in the class. When I went to university, it seemed natural to me to want to major in accounting. But I actually didn't major in accounting initially. Initially, I was finance. Finance was far too intimidating for me. So I switched back to accounting.
I love that story, though, from a failing grade on an exam to getting an A and then leading into a career in accounting and finance. It's amazing. Let's talk about, though, your big move to Johannesburg. How'd that come up and where'd you get the confidence to do that?
We were focused on helping our emerging markets figure out their growth and innovation plans. So how are they going to go to market and leverage the global brand and be able to monetize on that? So in focusing on a couple of different geographies, I became assigned to Africa. I was asked to basically do a 6 to 12 month tour in Johannesburg on the ground, working with local leadership to help them grow their business. And yes, it was a little bit different, right? Because I had grown up in the US. Yes, I had traveled. I had at the time spent a lot of time in London. But then going from those two markets to Johannesburg, having spent time also, for example, in Nigeria, very different cultures, very different environments for me. I felt a passion, I think, for traveling all the way back in my MBA studies when I spent time in China and Mexico and Brazil. So for me, picking up and going somewhere completely different was not that new to me. So I think I'd worked through that fear perhaps a couple years back in my career.
Wow, that is great. You really have traveled the globe and have been able to expand your experience and knowledge of different cultures from doing that. That's amazing. And that leads me into asking you, so how did your personal background in multicultural as well as international opportunities, upbringing influence the team you're building today at AAFC?
I grew up in a biracial, multicultural family. My mother's Vietnamese. My father's American, but he grew up French speaking. So it was, I think, starting very young. I was used to having been around multiple languages, different holidays, different customs, different traditions. So I think ingrained in me is that that's a natural kind of feeling in an environment for me. And early in my career, I was very eager to kind of get out and explore the world beyond Connecticut, where I grew up. And so that was something that I was very passionate about. I think AFC is a natural fit for me because we are very focused on being multicultural. As you mentioned, we have an office in Dubai. We focus our equipment leasing business in Africa. Being a multicultural team, you have to be open to learning new cultures, being curious about new cultures. So I'm a big fan of not assuming that I understand the culture. I always ask the questions and really try to make sure that we're working effectively together as one global team.
That is great. And I think you raised a key point there. It's a lot of people do one of two things I've noticed is they either make assumptions or they don't ask. And I think just asking and learning and being open to learning helps to make the culture more inclusive and people feel like part of it and that their opinions and their views are people care about that. And that's important for people. Tell us about the work you're doing across the globe and sort of your passion for helping more women of color enter C-suite positions like you are in the C-suite.
Yeah, I think that's probably a multifaceted question. So, of course, in terms of providing our financial solutions for equipment in Africa, that definitely sort of helps women in business in general. But as it relates to our business and the C-suite, I think a couple of things. Number one would probably be my background and coming into the organization with that experience of having been in a global firm, coming from a multicultural family. I'm very open to differences of opinion, different practices and ways of doing things. I believe contributing to the culture, that type of culture is helpful. And then also supporting females that are coming through the ranks in the organization, whether it's a mentor to help bounce ideas off of, or helping a particular female get a spot at the table in terms of speaking with the board. Even having a voice on the board. So I was recently appointed as the second woman on our subsidiary board in Ethiopia.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
Well, and tell us too about mentoring. So do you take on female colleagues and do you help mentor them? And can you tell a little bit about that and mentoring?
Absolutely. Absolutely. So we do have a diverse team, as I think we've established. And one of my members of management is a C-suite female in our subsidiary, and she's very skilled. She's very technical, very intelligent. I think where she's trying to find the next step in her career is really getting that seat at the table to have her voice heard. We've worked together to do that, to help her explain how she might get her point across if she disagrees, or have the gumption to do that without being afraid, being comfortable in her own views and her own opinion, because ultimately she knows those answers. It's really just being comfortable to have your seat at the table, sit with your CEO and potentially say, I have a different point of view.
Yeah, you raise a good point because so many women, it's there's fewer women with the seat at the table. That's growing and changing, thank goodness. But when they have the seat at the table, sometimes, even though they're there and they've earned their seat at the table, sometimes they're afraid to speak up and don't have that courage. And I think that's something we need to encourage women to make sure that they use their voice and to grow that confidence to be able to do so, because there's a reason that you're at that table.
Absolutely. I think that's half the battle, because most of the time we have the data. And especially in this particular situation, being in the risk area that she is, all the information's there and the facts speak for themselves. So it's a matter of being able to articulate that and not have, any type of fear in doing that. I think she's come a long way, and I'm very proud.
Well, it's awesome, Christine, that you're also investing the time to do that, and you see that that is an important priority and responsibility for all of us female executives to be able to pay that forward. That brings me to research, right? So research shows that more diverse teams create successful companies. Tell us about how you build a diverse company and culture and team from the ground up. Any thoughts or suggestions on that?
Sure. I think inherently we're lucky because we do business in Africa. So we're going to have by nature a very diverse team. But I think there's ways to make it more successful. One of the important points is being intellectually curious about the cultures, about the customs, about how business is being done. I never want to go into a meeting the first time in a country not knowing really how a message might be conveyed or how I should act or potentially present a problem or an issue. So I think that's important so that we show the right amount of respect for the culture and they're able to communicate effectively. Some of the things that we do at AAFC, for example, town halls. So there's always an opportunity for us to share across the organization, across geographies, what's going on in the company, what's the Csuite message that we want everyone to hear to ensure there's consistency, but also an opportunity for people to provide their perspective. I think finally would be probably the ability for us to allow a certain and appropriate level of autonomy in the different geographies, right? Because if there's a commercial decision that has to be made, who's going to be better making that decision? Someone in New York or someone in Ethiopia? And I think for us, we foster that balance between letting the local geography have say in how we deal with an issue or a new strategy. And that's very important.
Yeah, in fact, there's that saying that's, think globally, but act locally, I think is part of global teams. You have to be able to rely on the local offices to make decisions that suit their culture and their specific country. So that's great. What are some of the challenges of managing a team across the globe that you're facing today, especially in the pandemic when you can't go see each other? Or is it being remote helpful? Is it more challenging? I'd love your thoughts on that.
Well, I think it's more helpful and then I get more sleep and I'm not as jet lagged. But in reality, I don't think I would trade that. I'd rather be a little sleepy and be able to see the team. We have always been very in the market and focused locally. I've spent, in the short time I've been at the company, I've gone to Ethiopia, I've gone to Dubai, I've spent time on the ground. We believe that's the fundamental part of being a leadership team. So I think we're looking forward to being able to go back to getting on a plane and being physically together. But I think technology has allowed us to make do in the meantime. So we are always on Microsoft Team calls and we're on video a lot. We try to see each other over video, even if it's, not in person. So that's another thing we try to do. The town halls I mentioned are very important. And I don't go a day probably without speaking to key members of my teams. So that constant communication is very important and something we've tried to make sure is consistent since the pandemic hit last year.
Yeah, it's interesting, Christine. I was on a virtual event yesterday for CEOs of media companies. What one person said, which was an echoed sentiment, is that when we are able to travel, there's a lot of people who will demand balance, meaning they want the travel and they want to be in person, but there's a limit to how much you're willing to give up sleep and all that. Like people are enjoying the balance of being home some more with their families and all that. And I think, to your point, technology is definitely an enabler, and I think will help us going forward to find that balance so that you can have both. You can have in person when needed, and you can also have flexibility of remote working as well, or connecting with technology. I think that's going to be a key way of how we all move forward.
I agree.
So I know you're passionate about financial literacy. Could you tell us a little bit about the work you do to teach younger generations about finance?
Knowledge is very powerful. I think whether it's me and I'm learning a new skill or taking a new course, or whether I'm teaching at university, I think knowledge really helps us better ourselves professionally and personally. Being able to go back to, for example, my high school and teach younger individuals about finance and accounting concepts, that's very important to me, because ultimately that's going to help them as they grow into professionals themselves, or as they go and they lease their first apartment or buy their new car. And those are, if I can think back that far, sometimes very intimidating times when you're coming out of high school or coming out of university and you're starting your life. And so being able to give back in that way is very fulfilling to me.
You would think that in this year, 2021, that as a country and as a world, we've come so far, but yet there's so many places that still don't even require financial literacy as a requirement to go for high school to graduate, which is crazy, because you're making some big life decisions that impact you forever. I'm happy to hear that. And I know there's a lot of initiatives in the industry around financial literacy and getting more education and more knowledge, as you said, out there to younger generations so that they can live a productive, positive life and financial freedom. Tell us a little bit about what actions you believe companies need to take in 2021 to continue positive and meaningful change in the industry in terms of economic equality.
Yeah, I think we first of all need to think about resilience, because it is a challenging time. And so when we think about 2021 and looking forward, being innovative and being resilient, I think also believing in the ability to reinvent ourselves and think differently about how we do things. You had alluded to in prior the importance of technology. I think we need to think closely about how we can leverage technology so we can be more efficient and effective in how we run the business.
Absolutely. There's so much around that. Just technology at every level, not just in how we communicate, but Fintech. And Fintech is the disruptor of the financial services industry in general. So I think there's going to be a lot more focus and acceleration of technology across the board for sure.
Yes.
So Christine, then tell us a little bit about how people can learn more about the African Asset Finance Company, how to follow you and the company on social media.
Sure. Well, we have our website, and we are also on LinkedIn. So our company has a page, as does our subsidiary. And then I have my page as well on LinkedIn.
Amazing. So that's Christine Gagnon, Chief Financial Officer of African Asset Finance Company. So people can find you there. And you know what I ask all my guests, and my final question is always, I would love to know, in your words, why you believe her success matters.
Sure. When I thought about this question, I thought, well, I cannot find one reason why it doesn't matter. Because I think diversity of opinion, diversity of views, diverse teams, that's critical. I think it's very, very critical. It's very important.
That's very well said. I love the way you answer it. It's the first time anyone's answered that there's not a reason not to have it. I really appreciate the work you've done. And again, congratulations on being in the C-suite and all the work you're doing on behalf of AAFC, as well as the passion you have for teaching financial literacy. Women like you are so inspiring and so needed in this industry and in the world. So we really appreciate you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me today. It was a great pleasure.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Her Success Matters. Click the subscribe button below to be notified when new episodes become available, and share this podcast with others that believe her success matters.
The information covered and posted represents the views and opinions of the guest and does not necessarily represent the views or opinions of Investment News. The content has been made available for informational and educational purposes only. The content is not intended to be a substitute for professional investing advice. Always seek the advice of your financial advisor or other qualified financial service providers with any questions you may have regarding your investment planning.